we're not all called to be academics, but we are all called to be engaged with the world in which we find ourselves. We're all called to love our neighbor. I think in order to love your neighbor, you need to be able to understand your neighbor.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast. This show's available wherever you get your podcasts. If you like the show, please take a moment to review it on your favorite platform to let more people know about these interviews with great guests who are major thought leaders from many fields of influence, showing how our worldview changes everything. My guest today is Dr. Andrew Newell, a British guy. He's the Junior Research Fellow in Literature Theology at Wycliffe Hall and on the English faculty at the University of Oxford. He's researched and taught on topics including theology, poetry, hymnology, museology, and more. He's the editor of the Buechner Review, an annual publication dedicated to the work of the American author Frederick Buechner. Please welcome Andrew Newell to the show. Dr. Andrew Newell, welcome to the Dr. Jeff Show podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, with just that one sentence, people have noticed that you are from the UK.
Yes, yeah, I'm afraid so.
And you're visiting in Colorado to look at the Summit Ministries program, thinking about what kind of a relationship there might be between Summit Ministries and some of the things that are happening in the city of Oxford and in the various colleges right now. It's some really interesting and cool things. I think people are going to be really encouraged to hear about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's been such a pleasure to be here, and you've built a really amazing facility here, and just attending some of the lectures and meeting all the staff, and it's been really impressive. So, yeah, I feel like I've learned a huge amount over the past few days, and looking forward to taking that back and seeing what we can do.
Well, the students here have really taken to you as well. You've attended the lunches and the dinners.
Yeah.
And they sit around and ask questions, everything from what's the state of Christianity in the UK to do you guys text or use WhatsApp more?
Yes. Yes. Yeah, they have.
They have all sorts of interest. They just find this fascinating that you're here, that you're looking at what Summit Ministries does out here in the West in Manitou Springs, Colorado, and thinking that there might be some way to do something like this for evangelical students in the UK. And you've spent time visiting with a lot of our staff and students as well. And then we've had some time together. So it's really been fun. But I'm also mindful that when this show drops, it'll be about almost halfway through the fall semester of a college or university based on the semester system here in the States.
Yeah.
Your students will just be starting up.
That's right.
When the show begins. But our students will be, they'll be 6 or 8 weeks in by that time. Now, there's something that happens when you're a university student and you're 6 or 8 weeks in. The environment that you're in, if you're not strong in your faith, strong in your convictions, begins to take its hold. And we find, and I'm talking now to students who are at a university, people who have maybe brothers or sisters who are at a university, people whose children and grandchildren are at a university. Yeah. This is a pretty critical spiritual moment. And people may be watching this, who knows, in the future at any number of different times. But we've got a particular moment here that I thought would be interesting to address. Now, my question really then is, what does it look like to be a scholar and a Christian in an environment that is completely secular? So this is your challenge.
Okay.
That you're a professor at Oxford University. Your doctorate is from Oxford University. You've been in the Oxford community for many years now, and now you're also a research fellow at Wycliffe Hall.
Yeah.
And I do need to ask you the difference between a hall and a college and a faculty and a university and all that as we get into it. But this is the challenge that I wanted to just dig in and talk with you about. Christian, scholar, is there really a relationship? How do you see it?
Well, I think, firstly, I'm sure that many of your American students will be quite jealous that I'm sure that particularly actually in Oxford, the Oxford term doesn't start till early October and it finishes roughly around the first week of December. So it's an 8-week term. People arrive the week before. The days are numbered. So the week that they arrive is called Naughth Week or Zero Week, and then they have first week, second week, third week, fourth week, all the way up to eighth week, and then they usually leave in ninth week. So the first term we have is Michaelmas term, and that's in the autumn, and then we have or fall, and then we have Hilary term, and that's in the spring till Easter, and then Trinity term, and that runs in the summer. So actually, the students are in Oxford for a fairly short amount of time, really, comparative, to the entire year. But of course, they get worked very hard while they're there. They'll be
Yes.
writing several 2,000-word essays a week, and we can talk more about that later. But to your question as to how um, to the challenges that Christian students will face when at university, and then the then broader question of, well, how does scholarship and Christianity, or how do you kind of survive and thrive as a Christian scholar? I think that so my own experience arriving at university, I studied English literature did my undergraduate degree at the University of Liverpool, and the way that I kind of experienced, I must say that the faculty at the University of Liverpool really excellent and very friendly and kind, but also literature was definitely taught to me as the kind of history of atheism,
Hmm. Okay.
the sort of progression of civilization towards atheism, and um, its manifestation in literature. Um, and this for me was actually, I found myself being, I found myself almost kind of convinced by it in the way that it was framed. These are people standing up on podiums who, have doctorates from excellent universities, who know much more than me. And so the process that I had to really go through was, firstly, one of the things that kind of differentiated my work as an undergraduate from other people's work is that I was really interested in how pieces of literature interacted with the Bible. And so that's what I wrote my essays about. And I sort of still maintain that it's not really by talent or ability that I got to where I got. It's just that, the markers will have been so bored reading all these essays that will have been about the same thing, and then suddenly they had, an essay by some sort of random student, and it was about how some poem reminded them of Psalm 63, or whatever, and that was like, something that they hadn't read for the last 5 hours. They hadn't been reading things like that.
Let's just pause there real quick. That's super important. That
Right.
if you're trying to go to college and all you're doing is repeating what your professors say,
Hmm.
they've already heard themselves say that.
They
They already
have.
talk about it. They're easily bored as well and looking for engagement. And if you're
Right.
willing to engage, not by being judgmental, but by really taking a thoughtful approach to
Yeah.
bring your faith in, it's not as against the rules as you would think. Like they may actually appreciate and like the fact that you're a thinking person.
Yes, and I remember one time being invited to a dinner that the faculty had. I can't think of why they did that, but they were having dinner at a restaurant just around the corner, and they invited me to go. And one of the academics, who I respected and still do greatly, she sort of leaned round and said, cut across the conversation, said, "Anyway, Andrew, do tell us all, are you ever going to write about anything other than God?" And and they all sort of looked at me, and I think some of them had taught me, so they sort of knew the kind of things that I wrote on. Um, but yes, you're dead right that there's a definite human element to this, which is that a marker has been reading the same sort of thing for several hours, and then they come to your essay, and if it's careful and not extravagant, if it's well researched, and if it has the kind of the evidence of this person knows what they're doing and they can handle a text really well, then if you have written about biblical themes in a text, personally, if I was reading an essay like that, well, of course I'm Christian, but if I was reading a paper like that, I'd be very interested by it,
Hmm.
and I think that most of my colleagues would as well.
Hmm.
Um, and so, so really, what I had to do in that context was equip myself with and sort of reach into different areas of apologetics and sort of read more of the Christian canon in order to really grasp and understand more that uh, Christian philosophy, Christian theology is world beating. And in fact, it made the West and much of the rest of the world as well. It's deeply sophisticated. And whether you're a Christian or not, actually, it needs to be grappled with. And it can't just be dismissed as a sort of a thing that we've cast aside as a childish thing that kind of society has cast aside and found to be childish or backward. You can't actually do that with it. It's too good to be thrown aside. And so,
I need to ask you, and I'm sorry to interrupt because
mm,
I love where you're going with this. The Christian canon. Describe what you mean there.
yeah,
I don't. I mean, at Summit Ministries, we talk about a biblical Christian worldview
yeah,
because it's based in Scripture, in the Bible, but it's also based in the thoughts of people who were
mm,
very smart and dedicated to the Lord, who put all of those thoughts into the context of their age or
yeah,
different subject areas through time. And you called it a canon. I'm not sure I've heard the term Christian canon
okay,
before
yeah.
describing all of the Christian thought through the ages. But who would be some of the people in that canon? And when you say it's very sophisticated,
Well, I think that so for myself, I've been greatly formed by thinkers like um, Augustine and a little by Aquinas. Been formed very much by Calvin and Luther, and then many of the English Puritans, um, and then also people like Jonathan Edwards,
mhm,
and then in the 20th century by people like Abraham Kuyper. Um, so there's a whole range of even and then outside of Protestantism, John Paul II's theology of the
yeah,
body.
yeah,
Also greatly formed by thinkers like Leslie Newbegin. Uh, there's a whole there's an immensely rich, well, most of the literature, all of the literature written in the English language before sometime in the kind of 18th into 19th centuries was written within the context of Christendom.
mhm,
So it's written by people who, in some form or other, believed in the biblical worldview. And the English language is really formed out of the biblical worldview, as we were discussing earlier, but it also just came into being within the context of Christianity.
yeah,
And so really reading the works of long dead people, you can't help but dip it actually into Christian thought. The further back you go,
right.
everything that you're reading is in some sense relating to the notion that there is a triune God, and
And this is true in the
yeah,
sciences as well. You look back at those individuals whose contributions formed modern
yeah,
science, they're nearly all Christian
yeah,
in their orientation. And they're Christian by conviction.
yeah,
These people wrote a lot.
mm,
There's a lot that, that Faraday wrote, that Robert Grosseteste wrote,
yeah,
which is almost 1,000 years ago. But, you know, there is a body of thought that can't just be dismissed as people who had these thoughts a long time ago,
yeah,
and therefore it's irrelevant. That assumes a
mm,
progress narrative, which
yeah,
is actually a worldview decision in and of itself, as you and I've discussed.
yeah, very much so. And people who lived in the past were not stupid, and people who, people, um, just because they didn't have phones doesn't mean
Right.
that. In fact, people who lived in the past, actually, many of the people whose works we can read today, who lived in the past, had read. I can say with confidence that people like John Owen will have read far more in their lifetimes than I will ever read in mine.
Yeah.
Many of they had nothing to do but read,
Mm.
and they were excellent readers. They were people who could read for an entire day slowly, um, and with deep consideration, and could reread, and did reread. They read some books many times, and they lived in certain books and visited others, and so uh, yes to that, and also I think that. Um, with regards to the kind of the sort of progress narrative, as we were mentioning, actually, I wanted to say as well, something that you said the other day that I found really valuable and that is worth sort of saying again, is that the people that you're describing, the kind of the scientists, people like Isaac Newton, etc., they did science because they were Christians.
Right.
It's not a kind of interesting fact about their bio. And those aren't two
Yeah.
unrelated things. It's from a belief in an ordered universe, um, in a God who works logically, in a God who writes, and in a God who creates. That they felt that the universe therefore ought to be able to be read. Yeah,
Yes. The way we talk about it at Summit is they they knew through their experiences and their observations that the world was rationally intelligible.
yeah,
And to them, it was natural to conclude if it's rationally intelligible, it is so because it was made by someone who is rationally intelligent.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly.
So it took a whole new narrative to persuade people that a different world exists than that one.
Hmm. Yes, and so I think that. I sort of swallowed that narrative initially and felt like I was drowning in it. Um, I would say to I'd say to the young Christian who's beginning on a journey into academia or into the university, that there will be times when you feel as though you're drowning,
Hmm.
and there will be times when you feel that you're surrounded by people who are more intelligent than you or who know much more than you, um, and uh, you may feel at that point as though the faith that you hold to is perhaps untenable, or that it's difficult to hold on to in that context. And I think that what I would say is that, to me, I actually looked around not only at the Christians. At times I've done this. It's very simple, but I mean, I have looked around at the Christians who lived in the past, who I know were much more intelligent than me, but also at the many Christian theologians living today, Christian scientists, etc., who, for me as a 20-year-old, I could look at them, people who were in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, who'd seen much of life, who had giant bibliographies, the amount that they'd written,
Hmm.
and who were faithful Christians,
Hmm.
and who'd thought about it. And if they're okay, then perhaps I just need to keep reading,
Yes. Boy, that's a key insight.
and maybe it'll take a year, but actually, the more that I read, the more that I'll feel that I'm able to kind of, I can swim in these waters actually, and getting over the kind of cold shock is the key.
Yeah.
Just breathe.
Yeah. There's the positive side so people need to learn their
Mm,
history. Who are these thinkers who
yeah.
began with scripture and with a belief in God and with the belief that truth exists and it's a person, it's
Mm,
Jesus, not just a
yeah.
logical proposition. But we also need to look at the uh, the other side as well. And this is something that you do when you teach about worldviews. You talk about how the world that we assume exists today,
Mm,
a world people assume today, we live in a world in which God is not the creator and Jesus did not rise from the dead.
yeah.
So, but those thinkers they were people.
They were.
They were individual people. And I think sometimes we get so absorbed with the thoughts that we forget that the thoughts were thought about by thinkers. And those thinkers,
Mm.
many of them had lives that were tortured, evil,
Mm.
manipulative, abusive of other people.
Mm.
And that can't be separated from why they did the research that they did or came up with the conclusions that they came up with.
Yeah.
So you kind of demystify some of those individuals. When you teach worldviews, that's sort of how you do it, from what I understand. Yeah.
Right. No, that's right. And I think that the key, I think just listening to you talk, I mean, a thing that's not occurred to me before, so perhaps it's stupid, but I'll say it anyway. We'll see where we go. Is that I think the way that people think about philosophy, um, and the way that people kind of think about worldviews is they think about them in an almost scientific way, which is the way in which people think about science is almost as a kind of unveiling. Science is an unveiling of the truth, um, uh, in a manner of speaking. It's a process of discovery. It's almost like you begin in the middle of your map, but it's completely dark all the way around,
Oh,
and you don't know anything of your surroundings, but slowly you run around and you discover the truth, and you go on this process of learning what the world around you is, to the point where you see it. You go from seeing it kind of, to use biblical, you go through from seeing it in a mirror dimly to suddenly you see the world in 4K, and now I understand it. And that's almost like how people think about the process of scientific discovery, which there's obviously validity to that. I mean, we can see now, through the machinery that we have, we can see atoms, and we can also see
mm,
stars, and so there is a sense in which we are discovering. So perhaps thinking about science in that way, there's a kind of value in it, but we shouldn't necessarily think about philosophy in that way,
oh,
as a process of kind of unveiling and revealing of further truths and of progression. Um, Ideas come and go. New ideas are not necessarily better than older ideas, and philosophers don't necessarily reveal new truths that human beings have hitherto not found. Often, in my own experience, it's kind of akin to literary criticism, in that a philosopher will come along and will attempt to read the world in a different way, produce a different reading.
mm,
That's not the same as unveiling a truth.
yeah, that's right.
And so we ought not to necessarily think about, just because somebody wrote a book in 1960 and everybody was really quite taken with it and jettisoned older values for the views expressed in that book, and proceeded to kind of live by it for the next 50, 60 years. It doesn't necessarily mean that actually it's more valid or more truthful or more reflective of reality, of the actual world that we're living in, than the values that were jettisoned previously. It's just a different way of reading the world, that you can judge these alongside one another.
Yeah. Well, a student who is listening, or maybe this is a parent or a grandparent
Hmm.
watching the show or listening to it right now. We're talking with Dr. Andrew Newell, professor at Oxford University, and talking about Christian scholarship. And some of these these are really valuable key points that
Right.
you don't have to be afraid
Hmm.
when you're encountering a new idea. Somebody thought of that. That thinker is a person.
Yeah.
That person might be a very smart person. They may
Hmm.
have thought about a lot more things than you, but you don't necessarily need to just embrace whatever you hear because you hadn't heard it before. That seems to be the experience of so many students who go off to college. They're deconstructing their faith
Right.
because they're encountering arguments that they weren't familiar with and assuming that if it's new, it's
Mm.
therefore more true.
Yeah. I should say, before we continue, I'm not, uh, by kind of English metrics, I'm not a professor at the University of Oxford. That's a kind of very senior academic, attains to a
You're a
kind of
research fellow.
a research fellow. Yeah,
Okay.
I don't want to be mistaken for kind of pumping up my own tires on Julie. But yes, just because you discover a kind of new way of thinking, you don't have to adopt it. You can, and uh, there is wisdom in ancient ways of thinking. and the newness of a thing does not necessarily correspond to its truthfulness or value. It doesn't make it more truthful or more valuable. Um, so yeah, I think that for me, the process of discovering that as a young man, and um, of also, I hope, uh, acquiring or being given a kind of humility in the process, which as a 20-year-old, you in in this time in which we're living, I think perhaps more than any other, there's a real temptation to arrogance.
Mm,
There's a real temptation to thinking that you know more, that you know better than your elders who are living, as well as your elders who are dead. And there's a kind of, people dismiss the past, young people especially, without and there's a real arrogance to that, without really knowing anything about it. And to me, I had to kind of learn, gosh, I don't really know anything.
mm,
I need to read. And I'm 29 now. When this podcast comes out, I'll be 30. And I still don't know anything really. Like comparative, obviously, comparative to what can be known, I know nothing.
right, right.
In it, but um, even compared to my peers, to the people who I'm, I sit on the Wycliffe Hall website. Wycliffe Hall is my college at Oxford. Um, I'm sat next to N.T. Wright in
Hmm.
our little section, our little researchers section of the websites, which is hysterical to me that that I'm kind of sat next to him. The amount that he has read, the amount that he knows.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
And what he's written about, the experiences that he's had, the people he has known in his lifetime.
yeah. So I think that there is one of the great Christian virtues is humility,
Hmm.
and Jesus Christ was humble, which is astonishing because he's God.
Yeah.
Um, so, I feel that there's a kind of, there's a real call here to return to humility, and especially when you're young, to not follow the kind of the siren call of arrogance and a feeling that
Yeah.
you know everything. The powerful feeling of sitting with all of your peers, talking about how how terrible older generations are, how much better it would be if it had been you in charge.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah.
the call to resist that siren call, and to be humble. Certainly, there are things to criticize in the past. Of course, there are, because they were human beings. Um, but yes, humility.
In the kind of humility that you're talking about is the sort of humility that recognizes that if we were in that situation, we wouldn't have known what to do either if we were
Yeah.
governor or what else, or whatever. When I love to read biographies,
Hmm.
and I find it fascinating when I realize the complexity of things that people considered,
Yeah.
and then how do you make a good decision? Some of your decisions are going to be right. Some of them are going to be judged by history as wrong.
Hmm.
But it'd be really important. Robbie George is
Yeah.
he's a professor at Princeton and runs a really great program there called the James Madison Center. But he will ask his students, "Do you think that you would have opposed slavery?"
Hmm.
"Oh, of course," they say, 100%.
Yeah.
I would have opposed slavery. And then he says, "I want you to each write down on a piece of paper 5 current topics where you intentionally, purposefully, courageously, loudly stood against the orthodoxy of our times,
Mm.
knowing that you would be persecuted for doing so."
Yeah.
And the students obviously can't write down even one,
Right.
not to mention 5, because they go along with whatever their society says.
Yeah, it's very
So
challenging.
it's a humbling kind of exercise,
Yeah,
but an important one
yeah,
because you realize, oh, yeah, I guess when it comes to that, I'm
mhm,
not really that thoughtful yet. But you mentioned that it
yeah,
drove you to read more and
hmm,
study more, which I think is the important thing. It
yeah,
could also have the opposite effect, where it leads you to think, I'll never know what these people know. I'm just giving up. I'm just going to go through the motions, get my degree, go have my career, buy a house, get married, maybe
right.
have a child. It's just and give up on really the deeper thought life
Hmm.
of a Christian scholar.
Yes, and I think that we're not all called to be academics, but we are all called to be engaged with the world in which we find ourselves. We're all called to love our neighbor. I think in order to love your neighbor, you need to be able to understand your neighbor. Um, and uh, I think, if just to stretch that command from Christ beyond what he actually meant, I sort of include in that people who are dead,
Yeah.
um, because I owe them that to try and understand the time that they were living in, why they wrote what they wrote. I think that what ended up happening for me in academia is that I realized, and this is something that I intend to sort of write about, um, at Oxford, the methodology that we kind of that many people pursue in their writing is called, it's some kind of variation on historicism.
Mhm.
A way of sort of explaining that briefly to a young audience is reading texts in their context rather than seeking to place lenses on texts. That can be a really that can be a really valuable exercise. Take a way of thinking, a kind of maybe a modern way of thinking, and place it on a text and see what you see. There is something really interesting about that kind of academia, and I don't want to just kind of do it down. But to me, I think that first and foremost, the first duty of any kind of Christian academic, um, but in working in literature, is to try to ascertain, so far as you can, the truth about the text you're reading. What is this text attempting to say to its time? What was the author attempting to say? And that's a kind of controversial thing, the notion that you can access authorial intention, but I believe that you can.
Yes. Yes.
um,
Well, we do. Most Christians read scripture as if they can, but
exactly.
then sometimes we assume that when you skip over to the academic world, that you can't do it anymore.
Yeah. But you can access authorial intention. And functionally, everybody who reads sort of believes that you can,
Hmm.
whether they kind of operate like that in their day job or not. Um, Everybody is trying to read a book and trying to see what the author is trying to say to them. But I think that the job of a Christian literary academic is, to try and put it succinctly, is to try and, so far as you can, ascertain the truth about an author and the text that they wrote, and then communicate that truth to your readership truthfully, so far as
Yes.
you're able. And I think that you can expand that out more broadly into academia. I think that what all academics are fundamentally trying to do is find the truth about a topic,
Hmm.
um, and then communicate that to their students, to their colleagues, to the world via kind of speaking or written form. That's what we're all trying to do, is find and tell the truth. And so therefore, the kind of scholarly endeavor is, there's this kind of deep theology to it. It's quite a simple theology, but it's very profound. It's tell the truth, find and tell the
Yeah.
truth.
Yeah.
It presupposes that there is a truth there to be discovered, that you can do the discovering to a greater or lesser extent, and that then you can communicate it, and that people will be able to understand you. And that's what we're all fundamentally working towards. Even the people who actually think that they're not are doing that. They're writing books.
In a certain language
Yeah,
that they assume communicates with
yeah,
people. And they're assuming that the essence of what they're saying arises somehow in the minds of the people who are reading it.
yeah,
You know, no one writes a book and says, whatever you want this to mean is what it means for you.
yeah. And there's such an immense value in that. A person who goes off, and this is what, again, going back to the early scientists, if you read Jonathan Edwards, when he was a very young man, he was going around trying to document all the beetles that lived in his neighborhood. And why did he do that? Because he was he was attempting to kind of seek the truth, to seek to document the world around him that he believed that God had made, and then to communicate that to people, to set it down for posterity so that people could see what God had done and what the truth about that particular,
Mm.
that particular area was. So that's what we're all doing. And I think that it goes in the other direction as well. If you're not an academic, if you're just a reader, you are attempting to ascertain what truth is being, what is being communicated to you first and foremost in this text that you're reading. You're doing it in conversation, and we're all always about trying to find out what the truth is and then communicate it to ourselves and to other people.
We're talking to Andrew Newell, who is a member of the English faculty at Oxford University and also a research fellow at Wycliffe Hall. And as we're having this discussion, I just love the way you've put that. You're in essence encouraging the students to calm down and be patient
Yeah.
and work through the text until it is somehow working in them the thoughts that were originated there, and then you begin to ask the question, in our world today, what does this have to say to us?
Yeah.
But it's a patient process. It's the idea that you're hearing a new idea, therefore you have to decide immediately whether this is true or false, and if you can't refute it, then you have to believe it, is not the way academics
Yeah.
really operates.
Yeah. And I think that, I had my best friend, his doctoral his dissertation supervisor, undergraduate at the University of Liverpool, brilliant academic. She once said, and he and I laughed about this at the age of 21 or whatever. We would sort of talk about things that what academics had said to us, and we'd have those conversations. But she said she always felt that in literature, and she said it quietly, which is why I'm not saying her name, because she said it quietly to him, I think thinking that it would stop with him, that there's a difference between scholars and thinkers. And she was referring to literary academia specifically. But I think that second part of um, how does this relate to the world I'm living in? How does this relate to our time? That's almost the work of a thinker, really. The work of the scholar is trying to figure out, what was this person saying? Who were they saying it to? Why were they saying it? What is the context that leads to this piece of writing being written, and what's the author's intention, etc. That's the kind of hard yards. That's the first and the primary. That's the primary task, I think, of the scholar. And I think only then, once you've really done that, can you then pass on to this second thing, which is the thinker stuff. How does this relate to us today, and all that sort of thing? Now, there are English literature academics, hopefully listening to this show, some of them who are disagreeing with me violently about that, because they will hold a different view of the text. They'll hold an almost semi-theological view of the text, and they'll see it as a kind of divine, almost as a kind of divine thing. The author doesn't matter, and it's speaking to me in the moment, and that's all I can access from it. And then what I'm going to attempt to do is write, so they'll only do part number 2 because they believe that part number 2 is the only possible thing. But I think actually, as a Christian, it's important to say that part 1 is possible, and that's what Christian scholars, literary scholars, need to set about doing, but also all other scholars as well, is
Yeah.
that kind of truth-seeking
Yeah.
exercise.
Yeah. Well, this is a good counterbalance to the postmodern mindset that a lot
Yeah.
of people today have. As we get ready to close, I'd like to. I did promise earlier in the show that we would explain how the Oxford system
Oh yeah.
works. So
Yeah.
you have the Oxford University.
Hmm.
Then inside the university there are colleges and halls.
Yeah.
What's the difference between a college and a hall?
Okay. So to explain the system briefly, the university is made up of uh, colleges, which are sort of like, imagine them as being like sort of like small universities.
Hmm.
And each one will have an English department and a physics department and all these sorts of things. And they may have 2 or 3 academics in it, and or the larger ones may have 5 or 10 or something like that. Those are all of the colleges, and they are all under the umbrella of the University of Oxford. And so all of the members of the English departments in the colleges will also be members of the English faculty at the University of Oxford.
Hmm.
And so, when you apply to do an undergraduate degree, you don't apply to the University of Oxford, you'll apply to, I don't know, Balliol College to study
Hmm.
English. And through that, you will experience the kind of the English faculty more broadly. So that's the collegiate system. So then there are also a small collection of institutions that are like colleges, and they're called permanent private halls, as you mentioned. Wycliffe Hall is one of those. And so far as I understand it, and uh, in some ways the nature of the place is meant to kind of prevent you from understanding it. um, 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 these are institutions that kind of serve 2 masters in a way, and so uh, they are kind of under the jurisdiction of the University of Oxford, but also, say in the example of Wycliffe Hall, it also has a unique relationship with the Church of England to
Hmm.
the kind of the other colleges in Oxford, which don't particularly have a relationship with the Church of England, other than maybe having a Church of England chaplain in their chapel. And so that's what differentiates them. And the PPHs are they are all kind of theological colleges, and they all operate as seminaries within the University of Oxford
Got it.
in
Okay.
some form or another. Yeah.
Okay. Well, we've
So
talked
far
about,
as I understand it, I should say, if I've got anything wrong there, I'm sure people will people
well,
will email me. But
when you have an institution that goes all the way back to the 1100s, you'll develop complexity over time.
yeah.
That's not something we're used to here. Yeah. Although the building we're in is the oldest, probably the oldest building in Manitou Springs,
Mm.
and it's maybe 150 or so years old.
It's a
So,
beautiful building. Yeah.
well, as we get ready to wrap up, I'd love it, Andrew, if you could just give a word of encouragement to students who are maybe, uh, maybe they're feeling spiritually depleted as
Mm.
they're imagining finishing the semester, finishing the school year.
Mhm.
Maybe there's a parent or grandparent, and the calls they're getting home right now are a little alarming,
Mm.
possibly. Just give a spiritual word of encouragement to those
Mm.
individuals.
Well, I think that God has given us in His wisdom, has given us very accessible means by which we can encounter Him, and those would be chiefly through His Word, through prayer, through His people, and then through the world around us, through the natural world. If speaking to the student, if you have gotten away from any of those practices, or indeed if you've never tried them, then I would really encourage you to turn to those practices, because God can be encountered through those
Mm.
in ways that you can't imagine. Um, and then I think I would also say that, as I said before, in some senses, time is your friend. And um, more experience, more reading, more thinking, more conversation can take you down better roads and can help you understand the world you're living in much more, and the way you're feeling, the issues that you're facing. And so I would encourage you to kind of take time. And then I think, I think that those are the two things I'd say:
Yeah.
the means of grace and take a breath.
Yeah. I feel that in our conversation
Mm,
right now. I feel a sense of calmness that we speak about difficult things, recognizing that God is in charge
yeah.
and that we can rest in that world, and that
Mm,
it's Jesus's intention for us to find rest
mm,
in taking his yoke upon us.
yeah.
And then not to be frantically in pursuit of having to tie off every little
Mm,
issue, but to explore and to grow closer to God and to other brothers and sisters
mm.
who are on a similar journey at the same time.
I think, sorry if I may, the one other thing that I was reaching for is that it's something that I've talked about with several of your members of staff while I've been here. And I find it really encouraging to find that you kind of share this conviction, which is that what Jesus calls us to is to make disciples, not converts.
Hmm.
But the flip side of that is that we are to seek to be discipled in addition to seeking to disciple people. And so one of the things that has really helped me in my Christian life has been the company and the friendship of older Christians,
Yeah.
older Christian men and older Christian women. And the way in which my life has been changed, the direction that my life has taken has changed dramatically, and for ways much better, because of the work of God the Holy Spirit through his people, through older Christians who've discipled me.
Yeah. That's such a good word. Well, the way we phrase it to our students here is I need old people and they need me.
Yeah, amen.
Andrew, this has really been a lot of fun. Thank you for being on the show today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Thank you to my guest today, Dr. Andrew Newell, for coming on the show. The Dr. Jeff Show is a resource of Summit Ministries. Summit Ministries equips and supports the rising generation to embrace God's truth and champion a biblical worldview. If you want more resources that can help you live out a biblical worldview as a student or reach the next generation as an educator, church leader, or parent, head over to summit.org. Lots of resources there and information about our upcoming conferences and events. Thank you. We'll see you next week. Thank you for listening to today's episode. If you enjoy the show, would you consider leaving a review on your favorite platform? Reviews help more people find the show. And if you want more resources that can help you live out a biblical worldview as a student, parent, educator, or church leader, head over to summit.org/resources for articles, videos, ebooks, and more. Also, if you're looking for more great podcasts that will build your faith and inspire you, our friends at Edify have just what you need. You can find more podcasts, including the Dr. Jeff Show podcast, on the Edify app. You download it at edify.app, or you can search for Edify, which is spelled EDIFI, in the Apple and Google Play stores.